from for this session with the Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute, seeking to make sense of the President Biden, President Xi Jinping summit just concluded virtually between these two great powers of the 21st century. This comes at a time when we've had big developments in China domestically, and of course, leading up to this most important summit between the two. The big domestic developments are centered around the sixth plenum of the 19th Central Committee, with the Asia Society ran through the implications of that for Chinese domestic politics for the year ahead in a session we did last Friday. You can get that through our Asia Society website. But the bottom line takeout from that event in Chinese politics was to underscore within the highest councils of the Chinese Communist Party two things. Number one, the decisive significance of the core leadership of Xi Jinping as he becomes even more central to the political equation within People's Republic of China, departing, in my judgment, from the principles of collective leadership of his two immediate predecessors. And secondly, to underscore again the absolute centrality of the power of the Communist Party over other elements of Chinese politics, administration, the military, the economy, and of course, Chinese society. Enter, therefore, this summit, which comes literally 3 or 4 days after the conclusion of the sixth plenum of the 19th Central Committee. Xi Jinping came to the summit feeling pumped up and powerful from the events which had just preceded. And if you're playing the Machiavellian arts of Chinese domestic politics, he would feel that way. Of course, President Biden came to this particular summit also having secured passage through the United States Congress of a critical piece of legislation to underpin his economic plan for the country. And he came to the summit, therefore, with that level of domestic emboldening empowerment as well. On the content of the summit itself, that's where we're now going to turn and what it actually means as seen both from an American perspective, a Chinese perspective, as well as what it means for trade and the economy more broadly. And in doing this, I'm pleased to be joined by our two vice presidents of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Danny Russel, and of course, Wendy Cutler. Danny, his most recent experience is as the Assistant Secretary for East Asia in the State Department. Prior to that, also a senior official within the Obama White House, focusing on East Asia and Northeast Asia in particular during his White House stint. Danny also has just published a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, which you can find online, where he outlines his prognosis for both the summit and what it means for the future of the bilateral relationship. So we're pleased to be joined by Danny. Wendy Cutler, long-standing American public official who has worked extensively and at senior levels as in the US Trade Representative's office in Washington, rising to the position of active deputy director of the USTR, a person who therefore brings enormous experience and depth as far as her knowledge of the trade agenda in the region, globally, but also bilaterally with the US-China relationship. Our structure today is fairly straightforward. I will turn first to Danny to give his best analysis of how the United States has approached this summit, what they believe they got out of it, and what it means, therefore, for their conduct of this relationship for the year ahead. I'll then follow, trying to add to that by offering the Chinese perspective as best we can discern it within the first 24 hours through the official Chinese commentary, which has been released in the People's Daily and in Xinhua News Agency and in other sources, as we try to make sense of this summit from a Chinese perspective in their own domestic messaging. And then thirdly, Wendy Cutler will add and supplement our analysis by going to the critical questions for all of our viewers on the future of trade between these two large economies, the two largest economies in the world. If you have questions, please make sure that you send those in. They will then be sent to me, and I will then use the last part of our discussion today, running from questions coming from our viewing audience from across the world. Enough from me. Danny Russel, over to you. The American takeout, the American perspective, and what it now means in terms of Washington's conduct of the US-China relationship for the year ahead. Over to you, Danny.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. It's great to be with you and with Wendy. I'll start on the relationship and point out that the overall approach of the Biden administration in dealing with China has been intense competition based on domestic renewal and strengthened international partnerships. And if you put a theme or a tagline around this virtual meeting that's just taken place, I'd say it would be responsibly managing that intense competition. So for the US team thinking through and planning out this meeting, the aim was to unlock the ability of the Chinese system to engage with the US, engage seriously and constructively on urgent issues, on priority problem areas. And it definitely appears that they've made considerable progress in that effort over the 3.5-hour video meeting that the two leaders had. And, at a minimum, some doors have opened because, let's remember that diplomatic engagement between Washington and Beijing had really atrophied to next to nothing during the previous administration. And then to the extent that the Biden people experimented early on with reviving direct talks, they've found it profoundly unsatisfactory and unproductive. I mean, think of the Anchorage meeting, think of the gauntlet that the Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman was run through to get to Tianjin. So behind that, I think has been, some disappointment on the Chinese side that the Biden administration was not just maintaining tariffs, but maintaining a very tough line on China. And on the other side, I think a factor was the disappointment on the US side with the kind of grandiose and theatrical, ponderous dialogues that the Chinese have traditionally liked and that they tried to restart early in the year. And on top of that, and Kevin, I'll leave it to you to share your insights on this, but I can't not touch on the ideological rectification campaign, the ideological conformity that's underway in China under Xi Jinping, because the result has been that there aren't any apparatchiks in the system, even scholars who were prepared to take a chance of engaging constructively with the US. What the American side found was that their counterparts all thought that the wolf warrior approach was a lot safer. They were focused on proving their loyalty and their populist bona fides. So the Biden team reached the conclusion that they can't work up from the bottom of the Chinese system. They need to start at the top, and they need to try to take advantage of Biden's pre-existing relationship. Biden's careful not to call it a friendship with Xi Jinping nowadays, but it came awfully close. And that relationship is one of the few things left between the US and China that looked like it could prove helpful. And I can attest to the fact that Biden and Xi Jinping have a genuine personal relationship. And, as nobody knows better than you, Prime Minister, relationships between leaders are important in normal times, and in very tense and abnormal times like today, they can prove to be a godsend. So my take on this meeting is that it was well prepared and it was well executed. I know that the Biden team is satisfied with the way it went, with the approach that President Xi Jinping took and with the outcome. But the starting point for this engagement didn't suggest that it was necessarily going to go very well. Both of these leaders are dissatisfied with the behavior of the other. Both of these leaders are convinced of the superiority of their own system. They both have very strong objections to some of the other guys' policies and politics. They're determined to compete, to outcompete the other one. And they both have politics that push them in the direction of looking strong. But on the flip side, they're both very dissatisfied and worried about the state of the US-China relationship and are intensely mindful of the risk that some sort of incident or event could occur that led to a crisis and spun out of control. And it's pretty clear from the discussion that those are the sorts of concerns that really drove the meeting. As for the substance itself, I think there were several components to the meeting. First was a discussion, they are both politicians after all, of their own priorities, their own intentions. Here's what's going on in my country. Here are the things that I'm trying to accomplish, that I'm working towards and against. And, here's the nature of the relationship that I want my country to have with yours. And that's an important place to begin, particularly in dealing with Chinese interlocutors. They then moved into a session covering areas of, shall we say, divergence, i.e. categorical disagreements. And this was the sort of complaint box section of the discussion. From the US side, China is undercutting established norms and international law and values. It's not following the rules of the road. Rules of the road we're hearing again and again and again, coupled with another automotive metaphor, guardrails, which I'll come to in a minute. So whether it's Chinese unfair economic practices that Wendy will address, whether it's human rights, pressure on Taiwan, cyber intrusions, strategic nuclear risk. The complaints were partnered with a strong advocacy for the two sides to figure out how to establish what the administration in Washington likes to call guardrails, safeguards, to begin to build or rebuild processes and relationships and agreements that will set some boundaries that are capable of serving as mechanisms to enable de-escalation if things go wrong, so that competition doesn't deteriorate into conflict. Another area is the arena of, I'll use the favored Washington euphemism, alignment. There's a bit of an allergy to the word cooperation right now for political reasons. So how can we and where can we align with China? And that includes work together, at least not work at cross purposes, in the midst of the vigorous competition that both countries are pursuing. So that includes areas, and they discussed areas like climate change, like health security, plus a much wider range of transnational challenges. I don't think they delved deeply, but certainly touched on non-proliferation, narcotics, macroeconomic policies, and so on. Throughout, a very important message transmitted by the US side, and we see that in their external messaging now as well about the meeting, is cooperation and global problem solving is not a favor by China to the United States. It's not something that we are going to pay for. And partly this is driven by the position that has been taken by Chinese officials pretty much all year, which is, hey, you tied the knot, you untie it. If you want our cooperation, you've got to, adhere to and accept our core interests. So instead, President Biden framed this as, that responsible behavior is the obligation of two major world powers. And actually, that's pretty much in line with the way that the Chinese government talks about its international role, and it seemed to translate fairly well. And then mixed in both with the friction agenda item and the alignment or cooperation agenda is dealing with global hotspots where our interests can intersect: North Korea, Iran, Burma, and Afghanistan. Now, there's no hotter hotspot than Taiwan. It's not treated in the sequence of the countries I mentioned, in large part because the PRC doesn't view it as a country, but as a domestic issue. It was discussed, it was handled carefully in the meeting. And I think that, and in fact, let me ask you, Kevin, whether what she offered on Taiwan should be interpreted as a measure of reassurance about pursuing peaceful means to achieve unification, or whether it should be read as a threat about not foregoing the possibility of using force if splittist forces in Taipei cross red lines and so on. But on the US side, Biden offered a reassurance, a direct reassurance that the United States isn't changing its one China policy. It's not moving to support Taiwan independence. He, and this has now become a feature in the Trump and the Biden administration, he began the mantra of one China policy in the 3 communiques, not with the communiques, but with the Taiwan Relations Act. And I can imagine Xi Jinping squirming in his seat at that point, because the Chinese don't want to hear about a unilateral US law. They don't accept it as a foundational principle. But I don't know if this helped, but Biden made the point that he was actually in Congress and voted for the legislation when it came up. So at least he personalized it. And I will not address a little snafu today where he apparently made a remark to the press in another event about Taiwan being independent, but he subsequently came out to talk to the reporters and did a cleanup on aisle 3 correction there. Last thing I'll say, and I know I'm going long, is it took 10 months for these 2 leaders to get to the point where they can talk face to face. Now they have agreed to designate officials to conduct some direct talks. The administration is being very skittish about what exactly that's going to look like. What are the topics? Who are the people? What is the format? They don't want to make this seem too formal. They don't want to raise expectations. They don't want a lot of premature focus on dialogues that may not go anywhere. The president also today, sort of in passing, made some reference to 4 working groups. Who knows? But without a doubt, a big part of this effort is going to be to build out and develop these guardrails and these safeguards. Last thing I'll say is, let's remember that this is just the beginning. It's the start of a process in an effort to work the relationship out of a very deep hole. Mistrust is intense. The politics are unhelpful. The relationship has deteriorated. Both sides seem to be convinced that they're the stronger party, that they're in the right. And even if the dialogues and working groups get going, there's only so far that they'll be able to take these issues. So we hear Jake Sullivan and others stress this as a process, and we can regard this not as a one-off sort of summit, but an important milestone in a series of conversations that hopefully will steer the relationship on a steadier course despite the furious competition that's clearly going to continue. So let me stop there.
Good, thank you very much, Danny. Very useful readout in terms of how the administration is interpreting the 3.5-hour-long meeting. The view from Beijing, unusually, is not entirely discordant with the American readout. So what we've been doing in the last 12 hours or so is pouring through People's Daily, through Xinhua reports and other Chinese official and semi-official media accounts to discern how China is interpreting this summit to its own domestic constituency. That gives us some insight as to how they actually see the substance of the summit as well. I'll make three sets of remarks over the next 10 minutes. One is, in overall terms, what brought China to the table for this summit is what brought the Americans to the table, in my judgment. That is, both could observe that the bilateral relationship was spiraling downwards and had, frankly, hit rock bottom over the last 3 to 4 years. If we go back to the beginnings of the trade war in early 18, right through to the present, we can point to one series of events, statements, and or actions which have caused this continued downward spiral to occur. And I think both sides, Beijing and Washington, concluded this was in neither of their interests for this to continue, because once you peel away any accumulated political and diplomatic capital from the relationship, there is precious little left to manage a genuine crisis when it arises. Which brings me to the second overall strategic take that I see driving China's interests, and to some extent the United States' interests as well, which is the critical thing was to reopen the channel of strategic dialogue through the two principles. As Danny has correctly identified, dealing with anyone else in Beijing other than Xi Jinping, frankly, doesn't add up to a whole lot, given that he is the decision maker in chief, and frankly, down to a level of granularity which would surprise many American and international interlocutors. And so engaging numero uno, Xi Jinping, was critical to reopen, frankly, the arteries in both directions. And as a consequence of that, authorize at the most senior levels within the Chinese system a set of dialogues across a range of mutually agreed areas where some progress could now be potentially achieved. So at that level of realization in Beijing and Washington that this trend line heading south in the relationship was not good for either of them, particularly if a genuine crisis arose. And then secondly, in response to that, engaging the two principals, Xi and Biden, with a view to creating subsidiary mechanisms to handle some of the most difficult, but also some of the perhaps most mutually beneficial elements of the relationship still, means in overall terms that I regard the summit as a success, certainly from an American perspective, but also, I think, from a Chinese perspective as well. The Chinese media takeout, the Chinese gift for public political poetry knows no limits. And so you'll be pleased to know that in the Chinese official readouts, it's now described as the three principles, the four priorities, the two consensus, and the one important matter. I'm not about to go to those, other than to say that the one important matter, Danny has already touched on, it's Taiwan. But in the midst of all of that, there are, however, two or three kernels of Chinese political meaning, which I think we need to emphasize in this discussion today. One is, in the official Chinese readout, we see language around, quote, managing constructively differences and sensitive matters. And two, strengthening coordination, cooperation for regional and global hotspot issues, unquote. What that is all code language for is we are now strategically committing ourselves in Beijing to a mechanism which enables us to manage differences and manage bilaterally sensitive matters. Whereas in the past, as I indicated in my earlier remarks, there was none. And furthermore, not just in the management of politically sensitive, difficult, and dare I say, red line issues like Taiwan, but more proactively creating space, at least in the official Chinese readout, for strengthened coordination and cooperation in regional and global matters of common concern. So in other words, in the official readout, we see an underlining of the remarks made earlier by Danny and in my own introduction concerning a desire to re-establish both the conceptual framework and the bilateral diplomatic machinery to deal with the problems as they arise, the most difficult ones, as well as to advance a collaborative agenda where that is possible. In my last 5 minutes, let me go to what I think are probably 6 or 7 points of language which we should pay attention to in the rest of the Chinese official commentary, going to more individual areas. Number one, on Taiwan. And Danny asked before what sort of language now is being used in the Chinese official commentary on Taiwan. This is the most important, I think, part of the official readout. We are patient and willing to strive for the prospect of peaceful reunification with the utmost sincerity and best efforts, but always wait for the but phrase in Chinese official readouts, known to those of us in the trade as the 但是 or the 可是 line. But if the Taiwan independent separatist forces provoke persecution or even break through a red line, we will have to take decisive measures. So objectively, there is nothing new in that language compared with the Chinese official formulations in the past. But in terms of emphasis, given the level of tension across the Taiwan Straits militarily in recent weeks and months, the fact that Xi Jinping wishes to emphasize in his own domestic constituency language which now points to striving for the prospect of peaceful reunification with utmost sincerity and best efforts does send a signal to the system about taking the political and diplomatic temperature down a notch or two over Taiwan. This does not, however, in my judgment, fundamentally alter China's strategic purpose about regaining Taiwan to Chinese sovereignty, nor is it going to fundamentally ameliorate China's continued military preparations for that contingency. In fact, to reinforce this point, simultaneously with the release of the Chinese background briefing on the Xi Jinping-Biden summit, we've also had released in China the full text of last Friday's plenum resolution on Chinese Communist Party history, which delves into the Taiwan question and restates in clarion clear terms that you cannot have the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049 unless you also have Taiwan being part of it. And that is not so diplomatic code language for saying that is our endpoint. 2049 or bust, Taiwan will be back within Chinese sovereignty. And we look at our calendars, that's only 25 or 30 years from now. So the clock from Beijing's perspective is ticking, even though the language tactically for the immediate period ahead is more nuanced, diplomatic, and softer than we've seen in recent weeks and months. Another couple of points on the question of democracy. It's quite interesting, the formulation which Xi Jinping used on human rights. He said in Chinese, 民主不是一种制定的产品, which is a really interesting phrase. It is, democracy is not a pre-packaged, predetermined product. In other words, reserving to China the right to reinterpret the meaning of democracy from its own purposes and from different perspectives around the world. It's quite interesting that the cogency of the term 民主, meaning rule of the people, what we refer to as democracy, is of itself sufficiently valuable in the Chinese political lexicon that they can't attack democracy. But the process of Chinese politics domestically at present and internationally is a reinterpretation of what democracy means to make it compatible with China's own authoritarian political system. And he doesn't rule out in this language a dialogue with others on human rights questions. Thirdly, for an international audience, what's also important is his language on multilateralism. And he says, without US-China cooperation, multilateralism is incomplete. And so this is an invocation to the United States to unclog currently clogged multilateral mechanisms where the two countries can produce better results for the international community. And that's where I would start to look carefully at what will now happen on the Iranian nuclear deal. And that's where I'd start to look carefully also at what could happen if the two countries put their minds to it on future pandemic collaboration through the WHO, but beyond the WHO. And then thirdly, also on the critical question of climate change, which I'll come back to in a minute. I am mindful of where we are on time, but a third readout in the Chinese language is this. And again, this is in the Chinese official media pointing to remarks Xi Jinping made in the summit. China and the United States should advocate the international community to jointly maintain global energy security, strengthen cooperation in fields of natural gas and new energy, and work with the international community to maintain the security and stability of the global industrial chain and supply chain. I'm sure Wendy will come to the question of supply chains in a minute, but I find this language interesting and unusual for the Chinese to emphasize in a post-summit wrap. And on the question of supply chains, the language used there lies in some contrast with China's own domestically embraced economic doctrine now of national economic self-sufficiency in order to reduce China's overall net dependency on global supply chains across energy and raw materials, across key industrial componentry, across key technologies, obviously semiconductors, but also in other areas, including capital markets as well. Second last point I'd make is in the official readout language is on climate change. And this is quite interesting. She points out, climate change can definitely become a new highlight of Sino-US cooperation. I've not seen that language before, and certainly not from him. And the Chinese is interesting. Xi Jinping 指出, Xi Jinping points out, 气候变化完全可以成为中美新的合作亮点. And it's literally that climate change can completely become 完全可以 a bright point, a 亮点 of bilateral cooperation between China and the United States. He then goes on to say, of course, China is still a developing country and there is common but differentiated responsibilities on climate change. But this is the highest level political signal from Xi Jinping personally that I have seen, authorizing the sort of work that we saw initialed, if you like, by John Kerry and Xie Jinhua in Glasgow recently when they reinvigorated the US-China bilateral climate change working group. And the final point is on what is needed for the future on public health. And Xi Jinping says what is needed is a scientific attitude that politicizing the disease problem will have all harm but no benefit. And we must have as a top priority the global fight against the pandemic and to break the vaccine deficit around the world and to eliminate the vaccine gap. That, of course, is a pitch to the rest of the world, in particular the developing world where there is so much vaccine inequality at present. But it's also a partial pitch to the United States that given the future unknown terrain for the future evolution of the virus, we, the US and China, should think about how we could collaborate next time around rather than simply attack each other, which is what happened under the Trump administration. Of course, this is a massively domestically sensitive issue within China in terms of virus origins and the failures of China to contain the outbreak in Wuhan at the beginning of 2020. But that's a different story for a different occasion. This is about the whole question of could we now, the US and China, turn the page as far as the next phase of collaboration on the pandemic is concerned. To conclude, therefore, the language, I think, when you unpack it, obviously has some levels of differentiation from the US official readout. But overall, I remain with the logic that I reflected earlier in my remarks that Xi Jinping and the Chinese system have reached a conclusion. They don't want this relationship to spiral completely out of control. They too are interested in managing it. And the doctrine, which of course I've been arguing for many, many years now, is this relationship desperately needs a framework of managed strategic competition. By the way, there's something just out from the Chinese which says that they are about to look at a first practical step in communications improvement between the two countries by relaxing restrictions on journalists' visas. So that's quite an interesting first, as it were, concrete manifestation that the overall temperature of the relationship is being taken down a notch or two. Wendy, tell us what's happened with trade and what it means for the global economy. Over to you, my friend.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Danny. It's hard to follow up on both of your presentations. Before I get to trade, if I can just make two general points. I think that this summit meeting was a success. And I think both of you underscored, both from the US and the Chinese perspective, it was successful. And in that regard, I think we really need to give credit to the officials from both sides who spent hours preparing for this meeting. I think in the last administration, that preparation didn't occur. And as a result, those meetings were dramatic and erratic. And this time around, it seemed like things went smoothly. It doesn't mean that both sides agreed on most things, but the meeting did go smoothly. But I think the real test will be what happens in the weeks ahead and what happens with respect to engagement by US and Chinese officials as a result of this meeting of the leaders. And we'll see how that unfolds. Second, I would just like to emphasize that the White House, particularly in the past 24 hours, has made a real effort to insist that they're not looking to institute new mechanisms or new dialogues, but more channels of communication, kind of engagement that would be issue specific, outcome oriented, and wouldn't kind of, get us back in a situation where we were in endless hours of discussion with no real outcome or no substantive progress. So I put those two matters on the table. Now, with respect to trade, I would say that it was not a dominant agenda item. And this contrasts sharply again with the previous administration, where the summit meetings were kind of all about trade. They were talking about agriculture. They're talking about tariffs. They were talking about, technology theft, and they were talking about currency manipulation. And this meeting, it seemed more that each side kind of made their points, and then they kind of went on to the other subjects that Danny and Kevin elaborated. President Biden underscored the importance of Chinese adherence to the phase one obligations. In my mind, that means both the rules and the purchasing commitments. He also used the phrase of wanting to protect US workers and industries from Chinese unfair trade practices. And I found this interesting in that he wasn't insisting that China change its practices. It almost seemed like more of a realistic view that China may not change these practices. So therefore, it's his job to make sure that that unlevel playing field doesn't come back to bite our workers and industries. President Xi, he talked about the US politicizing trade, which I found a bit ironic given the kind of methods and mechanisms that China is using now to politicize trade with other trading partners. And he complained about really export controls and entity list restrictions that, in his view, have come to suppress Chinese companies. But beyond that, when I look at what happened on trade, I also think about what they didn't say, what was not mentioned. And I think the obvious omission was the mention of tariffs. And this probably is to this strong disappointment of the US business community, which has been urging the lifting of these tariffs, and most recently in a series of letters from both the US business community and certain members of Congress. Second, President Xi was pretty quiet about phase one implementation. And I found this curious because in many respects, particularly with respect to the rules portion of the phase one agreement on IPR, technology theft, financial services, China has a pretty good track record in implementing those commitments. It clearly has fallen short of its purchasing commitments, but given COVID and the mismatch in supply and demand, I think it could argue that it made its best efforts. And finally, given what Xi said just a week ago at the Shanghai Import Expo, when he talked about his willingness to negotiate on subsidies and state-owned enterprises, really the structural reform, non-market economy issues that are of such concern to the United States, he also was silent. And I found that curious as well. And it led me to believe, is China really serious about negotiating in these areas? Now, Kevin just mentioned a concrete deliverable coming out today about visas for reporters. I would say the other kind of concrete deliverable that Xi Jinping mentioned was his interest and his commitment to facilitate business travel for U.S. executives. This has been a huge sticking point for the U.S. business community, and frankly has led many to reconsider whether they can remain in China given the long quarantine processes and the difficulties getting in and out of the country. And so this was announced by Xi, and we'll see how and when it's implemented. I would also say this is not totally altruistic. China needs U.S. foreign direct investment. It needs the exports stemming from U.S. foreign direct investments, which has been a key driver for Chinese economic growth in recent months, particularly at a time when headwinds are working against Chinese economic vitality and growth. Now, if I can just conclude briefly on broader economic issues, when you looked at who was in the meeting room, you couldn't help but notice that Treasury Secretary Yellen was there along with Liu He. And I suspect that we will see engagement between those two, in the days and weeks ahead. Both countries are experiencing economic headwinds. The global economic recovery is kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And some of the recent third quarter growth numbers coming out of corners of Asia are not encouraging. And as Kevin mentioned, there's great concern about energy security and volatility in energy prices. So we also may see our Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, meet with her counterpart as well. So in conclusion, I think the economic issues on the agenda, but not front and center. And frankly, I don't think that's surprising, particularly given that, at least with respect to trade, Ambassador Tai is already engaged with her counterpart. And she just mentioned a week ago that she was gaining traction with her Chinese counterparts, in at least with respect to implementing the Phase 1 agreement. Back to you, Kevin.
Good. Thank you, Wendy. Let's just stay on the trade and economy question for a moment. And your observation was absolutely right, that when you have both Janet Yellen and Liu He in the picture, it does mean that both leaders are signaling to their own systems domestically, but also internationally, that there is much work now to be done by, frankly, 2 senior economic officials within their respective administrations. Secondly, knowing Liu He and knowing actually Janet Yellen much less, but given her own experience at the Fed, inflation will be deeply top of mind in terms of a challenge to the global economy, a challenge to the United States economic recovery, and a challenge, frankly, for many states. And inflation is being driven by goods inflation, wages inflation, inflation in energy prices and in raw materials, but also, frankly, inflation in the cost of international shipping, which is almost worth a separate seminar in itself. So given all these inflationary dynamics and, frankly, the central challenge they do represent to the sustainability of global economic recovery, as an analyst, what I would say is, therefore, there is an overwhelming case to begin immediately to tackle the tariff wars between the 2 countries, because tariffs are inflationary. And the second point, of course, that is compounding inflation is, let's call it, the new security-driven restrictions around global supply chains. You have language from Xi Jinping pointing to supply chains and the need to, as it were, depoliticize them, whereas China's domestic policy is still increasingly tilted towards national economic self-reliance. And Wendy, you know Washington better than most of us on these questions. So on tariffs and supply chains, take out your crystal ball and tell us where you think, as someone who has been a very senior trade official in the United States, where Catherine Tai and the team may be authorized now to take this agenda in the months ahead. Back to you, Wendy.
Well, no matter how concerned I am about the tariffs and how they have come to bite the United States more than China in a number of product areas, I just don't see a scenario between now and the midterm elections where the US lifts tariffs, even if on a reciprocal basis. I think that's unfortunate because I think there are baby steps that could be taken. For example, both sides could agree to lift tariffs in the medical sector. I mean, that would make perfect sense to me, given the COVID and the aftermath. What I think we will see is both sides focusing on granting and continuing to grant product exclusions. The United States has resumed its product exclusion process, but in a modest way. And I know that the US business community is hopeful that that will be expanded to allow for application for tariff exclusion for new products, not just products that have already received exclusions. And frankly, for China, China has also exercised generous exclusions to US imports. My understanding is that these exclusions are to expire by the end of the year, of grave concern to many US exporters. So perhaps that's where the tariff discussions are focusing on, not on actually lifting the tariffs, but allowing for exclusions to expand and to continue. So both sides, particularly the US, can say, we're tough on China. Those tariffs remain in place until China deals with some of the fundamental unfair trade practices that it's pursuing.
Good, Danny. One of the questions which has come in is, how do you think the Taiwanese will read this? How will they read the summit? How will they read the language on Taiwan? I know you've worked a lot on the Taiwan question yourself in the administration before. What do you think?
Well, the language coming out of the meeting from the US side offers no cause for concern to decision makers in Taipei. Biden strongly emphasized, as I mentioned, not only a one China policy and 3 communiques, but particularly front-loaded reference to the Taiwan Relations Act, and, as has lately become the norm, added onto that the 6 assurances provided to Taiwan at the time of or provided to both Taiwan and the US Congress at the time of the 3rd communique. So I think that the readouts, both public and the direct debriefings that US administrations routinely do with the Taiwan authorities subsequent to any major US-China engagement will be reassuring. I think there is a further degree of comfort that they will take, perhaps not entirely justified and not entirely constructive, from the fact that President Biden seems again to have let his tongue get ahead of him a bit in describing today in an encounter with reporters, as I mentioned, our policy being based on the Taiwan Relations Act, and going on to say they're independent. Taiwan is independent. He subsequently, as I mentioned, came back to the reporters and said, hey, there's no change in our one China policy. But both Beijing and Taipei, I think, have a proclivity to see a diabolical plan here that on paper and nominally in formal meetings and so on, the US position is the orthodox one. But in reality, and as opportunities present themselves, President Biden, whether it's at a CNN town hall or elsewhere, takes a very forward-leaning position that's inconsistent, frankly, with the orthodoxy. For Beijing, that is a horrifying signal that starts all kinds of worst case scenario planning. For the Taiwans, it has the opposite effect and may give rise to unfounded and potentially destabilizing hopes and expectations. As for the glass half empty piece of Xi Jinping's statement about his patience not being unlimited, and that if the splittist forces in Taipei cross a red line, then China will take decisive action. This is part of a longstanding pattern of the PRC, and particularly Xi Jinping, purporting to blame Taiwan for things that China doesn't like that the United States has done. In other words, these malevolent and wily characters in Taiwan have duped you, Joe Biden, into moving too far in the wrong direction, and I'm administering a stern warning to them. This is unwelcome, I'm sure, in Taipei, but not unexpected.
Question for both of you, and to reflect on, given your knowledge of how Washington works. That is, the administration now for more than 6 months has been engaged in its own strategic review of American-China strategy, for want of a better term. And this has been an exhaustive interagency process, which is natural and normal in the machinery of government. Can you give us a sense of where you think that process is now up to from both your perspectives? Secondly, when we're likely to see anything public about these, as it were, directions of US strategy in the future? And thirdly, how does it now dovetail with the dynamics of this summit? And so perhaps I start with you, Danny, and then chip in, Wendy, as you judge it to be appropriate. Back to you, mate.
Well, each administration early on is obligated by Congress to prepare a national security strategy. And a great deal of work has been in train in the Biden administration to prepare that document, which traditionally has both a classified and an unclassified version. The Biden administration, interestingly, stole a march on the process by issuing, within its first few months, an interim national security strategy, which laid out some of the now familiar tenets about reviving American competitiveness, building up domestic renewal, working closely with allies and partners, defending a free and open, not only Indo-Pacific, but international system, et cetera, rules of the road, all that. There are 3 documents that are have been under development and are close to fruition. One is the National Security Strategy, which is a comprehensive document covering, planet Earth and beyond. The second is a classified China strategy, and this is not meant for public consumption, but will be accompanied by a fuller description of the approach that the Biden administration is taking to competition with China. And that is very clearly, I believe, linked to the messaging surrounding yesterday's virtual meeting. We'll hear more of those themes. In the actual China strategy, however, is likely to be a game plan for what it is that the United States itself as a nation and as a government needs to do to be in a position to compete and to outcompete China across a spectrum of sectors and domains over the coming decade, as well as how our partnerships and our alliances are going to fit in. So there will be this public-facing piece, which will be explanatory along the lines of what we heard about responsible competition and there will be the internal government only and partner government only classified piece that will be a little more of a how-to manual, a to-do list. And the third document is an unclassified paper called the Indo-Pacific Strategy that has been written and that's being refined right now. That I think as a general matter focuses on the question of what are the policies and approaches that the United States will employ? What are the objectives and the principles that will guide the United States going forward in dealing with a full range of partners, friends, and maybe not so friends, but still important members of the Indo-Pacific community. This is not a document about China. And it's not even really a document about China's strategy, although, of course, any approach to the Indo-Pacific is informed by the consequential growth of Chinese influence and power. This is really about what the United States is and should be doing itself in the region and with partners, including, I should add, transatlantic partners to help sustain and build the Indo-Pacific that we'd like to live in. All of these documents are very close to ready. And I honestly don't know what the timing is. There's a wonderful expression that my former boss, Tom Pickering, who was ambassador to Nigeria, among other places, used to invoke, which is anytime starting now. I think that's the best answer to the when question.
That's good. Wendy, a minute or two from you, if it's okay, because I'm mindful we've got about 3 minutes left. And I wanted a concluding comment from Danny about what it all means for the Quad and AUKUS as we close up. Wendy?
Yeah, it's interesting when I think of these reviews and having been a member of a number of administrations, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the beginning. We're going to review. And then as the reviews get underway and you look at how complex these issues are, and you also think about how you're going to communicate them to the public, because there's an expectation that something's going to come out and there's going to be some new policies. I look at what Catherine Tai did with respect to the top to bottom review of US-China trade relations. And frankly, this is a review USTR undertook for months. And within 10 minutes, she gave a speech to a think tank in Washington and kind of communicated the results. And they were vague. They disappointed a lot of people. But at the same time, they did have certain actions that she's undertaking. And so I wonder if this will be a model for communicating some of the results to the public, not only the policy community in Washington, but broader.
Good, thank you for that. The hazards of documents intended for declaratory use as opposed to those for internal operational use, which I've always been deeply skeptical about the declaratory utility of these documents. But that's just me from a hard-bitten Australian perspective. Danny, just to close out, because it's become part of the questions in our chat box here, any particular implications flowing for the summit in terms of the future direction of the Quad and AUKUS? And then I'll wrap up in a minute or two after you've finished.
Yeah, I think that both the Quad and AUKUS in their own ways are a manifestation of the Biden administration's focus on intense but responsibly managed competition. In the case of the Quad, it is a competition for hearts and minds in the region. The Quad are four formidable industrialized democratic nations who are putting their heads together on the question of how they can jointly contribute to the welfare and the well-being of the entire Indo-Pacific region, including and particularly starting with Southeast Asia. So this is about the whole being larger than the sum of the parts, the Quad working together for others' benefit, its contribution. The AUKUS agreement is, quite apart from submarines, also a tool for enhancing competitive edge on the part of the US, Australia, and the UK by sharing and collaborating on the most advanced defense technology. It is not a military threat to China. It's not a NATO-ish configuration, but it is very much an effort to outcompete China in the area of advanced military development.
Good. This has been a great discussion. Thank you to both of you for making sense of the Xi Jinping-Joe Biden summit. It's been a long time between drinks since we last had one that we could discuss. It's good that we now have one to discuss for those of us who have a view that war is not a good thing, and therefore finding a way to navigate peace and navigate differences is actually the better way forward. From my perspective as president of the Asia Society, this notion of managed strategic competition has been near and dear to my heart for many years now. It's probably the only sort of framework which can prevent the structural tensions in this relationship from erupting into an irreversible crisis, conflict, and escalation resulting in war. And managing, therefore, the competition short of war, and managing, as it were, areas of continued collaboration. For our audience, I have a book coming out on this subject early in the new year. But I'll draw your attention also again to Danny's most recent piece in Foreign Affairs, Wendy's piece in The Hill. And if you're seriously nerding out there, there's another piece from me in the Wall Street Journal last weekend on making sense of Xi Jinping's 6th plenum of the 19th Central Committee. That's a great conversation starter for any Friday night drinks in either Washington or New York. What's your latest take on the 6th plenum of the 19th Central Committee? In terms of upcoming events, let me simply underline a few that we've got coming. Danny has a major exercise which will be released on the 30th of November on stacking the deck, looking at how China is using its influence in digital rule setting to deliver favourable outcomes from China's national perspective. Then on climate change, this coming Friday, in cooperation with the Asia Society Centre in Switzerland, I'm undertaking an event on COP26 and the Indo-Pacific's quest for net zero. And we're doing that in partnership with Swiss Re, the Swiss insurer. And so that's it from the Asia Society on this important development. We'll have more to say, more to comment on. You'll see an ASPE note delivered on our collective deliberations on the significance of this Xi Jinping-Biden summit. But I agree with what Wendy said in her opening remarks. Frankly, both sets of officials, Chinese and American, both leaders should regard this particular summit as a success in terms of the relationship bottoming out, we hope, a new predisposition towards stabilization, and channels, if not machinery, reopened to deal with the complexities ahead. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.